Well, today we are waiting for the not entirely convenient truth about the U.S. participation in World War II, misunderstandings about the date of the beginning of the conflict, cavalry against tanks, atomic bombs, and many other interesting things. We will be glad to hear your suggestions about the following videos in the comments, but for now, let's start by going back to 1939. It is traditionally considered the date of the beginning of the Second World War, to be more precise, the 1st of September of this year, and the day when Germany attacked Poland. This statement of course makes sense, but with every year that has passed since the war, the history of the Second World War is becoming more profound. Its consequences are being studied better and better, more and more documents are being deciphered, and historians from various countries have their own opinions on certain issues. The date of the outbreak of World War II has been widely discussed in all countries in recent years. For example, one of the alternative dates is considered to be May 1939, when the Soviet Union and Japan clashed on the Mongolian-Manchurian border. The battles on Halkingol were very large-scale, and for example much larger than the individual battles of the Second World War. After all, almost 60,000 people spoke from the USSR, and the Japanese side numbered as many as 75,000. Losses from various sources are also estimated in the tens of thousands. And the impact of the Second World War was very powerful. The crushing defeat of Japan was another brick, because of which this country decided to switch its attention to the Pacific Ocean. Also, do not forget the Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937. Her description makes one's blood run cold. There are chemical weapons, Squad 731, and the insane war crimes of the Japanese army. Even modest sources estimate civilian casualties alone at 12 million, while according to Chinese data, the total number of casualties reaches 35 million. There is also the Italo-Ethiopian War, the Slovak-Hungarian War, and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. These are all countries that took part in World War II. Yes, as such, it is not a myth that the Second World War began on September 1, 1939. But do not assume that before that, everyone lived in neutrality. In fact, since the early 30s, the world has already plunged into the abyss of conflicts, and some of them were staggering in scale. The next topic of conversation is already dragging on: the name of the total myth. And this is a myth, that the Second World War was a completely mechanized conflict of high technology at that time. Tanks against planes, submarines against battleships, and other movie footage, of course, were there. However, one should not forget that, as in the case of the First World War, huge amounts of military equipment began to appear a little later, when the countries completely switched to a military mode. And even in this case, the good old horses continued to play a key role. And even more so at the beginning of the war. In the German army, for example, in 1939, 514,000 horses served. This is 3 times more than the number of mechanized transport units. At its peak, the number of active horses in the German army exceeded 1 million, and almost 3 million of them went through the war. At the peak of the war, almost every infantry division had a separate reconnaissance battalion of 200 cavalrymen. Is it worth mentioning that the situation was similar in other countries? Moreover, Soviet cavalry battalions on horseback took part in the offensive on Manchuria as early as August 1945. In general, there were classics in the Second World War, and this unwittingly gave birth to a second myth related to Poland. Everyone knows how quickly the country fell, and most people have scenes in their heads of poor Polish cavalrymen marching with sabers on a tank. Similar words can even be found in textbooks. And this, of course, is a complete myth. It is based on the real Battle of the Krayants. Only, of course, the Poles were not idiots, and did not rush at tanks with pikes, because there were no tanks there. They have already arrived at the end. But in reality, the Polish cavalrymen even dispersed the Germans with the first attack. Moreover, there was even an order to organize a retreat, which was cancelled only by General Guderian, who ordered to put on machine guns and bring armored vehicles. By the way, the Poles also had something to knock them out in this battle. They had anti-tank guns and rifles in their arsenal. The German army simply turned out to be stronger and, technically, crushed the enemy. And then she used the victory to create a myth about stupid Poles who went to tanks with sabers. Since we are talking about Poland, let's mention other small countries. History is written by the winners, and terrible things can happen to it over time. One forgets even which country has suffered the most terrible burden, and textbooks usually don't mention small participants like Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia at all. Meanwhile, Romania's losses in World War II are greater than those of Britain and France combined. And that's only if you count the troops. Together with the civilians, not only Poland, but even Yugoslavia lost more than France and Britain combined. Yugoslavia mobilized more people during the war than Italy. And Hungary lost more soldiers than France. More Greeks died in World War II than Americans. And loss is a very sad and difficult topic, which, frankly, the language does not rise to talk about. We just hope that the world will remember not myths and movies, but the terrible statistics and the full picture of events. We will not even mention the fact that the Allied landings in Normandy are supposedly the defining moment of the Second World War. We hope that such obvious things do not need to be explained. Let's talk about one more movie myth. It is connected with the fact that in almost every film you can see orderly queues of volunteers going to war. The reality was much sadder. In the United States, according to the American National Museum, only 38% of soldiers in World War II were volunteers, and almost two-thirds were conscripted against their will. For example, during the Vietnam War, which in popular culture is inextricably linked with uprisings against the war and movements for pacifism, the situation is radically the opposite. There, conscripts made up only 25% of the total, and more than 2 to 3 soldiers were just volunteers. It is worth noting, of course, that the absolute number of those who served in World War II is higher, and this factor also plays a role. But still, the percentage of patriotism from the Marvel movies with Captain America was enough. Let's talk about Lend-Lease. You can often find photos of buttons and other equipment on the internet, proving that the USSR was able to win only thanks to the help of the Americans. The fact of the existence of Lend-Lease, of course, is indisputable, has no place to be. Moreover, the second most successful Soviet ace pilot, Grigory Andreevich Rechkalov, made many successful flights on the R-39 Air Cobra. But the vast majority of sources forget that the bulk of Lend-Lease goods arrived in the USSR in 1943 and after. According to a recent 2012 Lend-Lease study, in 1941, the USSR purchased goods worth $741 million and received 541,000. And this is logical, because there were terrible problems with logistics. In 1942, almost 30% of the Lend-Lease volume was received, but the vast majority, more than 70%, was seen in the USSR after 1943, which is very, very cool, but still it's not worth exaggerating the role of Lend-Lease in World War II. Or, at least, don't forget to pay attention to other figures, according to which the USSR generally received 27% of total aid, while the UK received almost 70%. Let's talk about atomic bombs. The bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the culmination of World War II, and of course their effect is also greatly exaggerated. To begin with, before the first atomic bomb explosion, the United States had already conducted large-scale bombing of as many as 66 Japanese cities. It is not so important for people's buildings whether fire or atomic energy bombs them. The fact itself is enough. On March 10, 1945, 334 B-29 bombers attacked Tokyo and caused a living hell there. These losses are quite comparable to the damage of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Entire residential areas were reduced to ashes, and the maps from the air before and after the bombing look no less terrifying. And it's only on March 10th, earlier, on February 23rd, 74 bombers were bombed. And if you look at the whole story, Tokyo was ironed in 1944, and there were no fewer other cities similarly driven into the ground in Japan. Yes, the atomic bombings, among other things, had a psychological effect, but most historians agree that the main reason for Japan's surrender was the entry of the USSR into the war with it. For a long time, the myth circulated among the masses that the Germans themselves were close to creating an atomic bomb, which is also fundamentally wrong. It is worth separating the concept of launch vehicles and bombs directly. The Germans really had missiles ahead of the entire planet, but it didn't work out with the atom. For detailed explanations, it is better to turn to the channels of physicists. But the established point of view in the scientific community says that the Germans initially chose the wrong path of development in their nuclear program, and even by the end of the war, their reactor at Haigerloch had not started working. Although the same Americans were already preparing to test fully operational atomic bombs. Of course, the sad situation at the front played a role for Germany, but still, most physicists believe that with the progress available in 1943, the Germans would have needed another 5 to 10 years to fully master the technology. And even that's not a fact, because supply chains began to crack already at that time. Well, let's finish our issue with resistance. In the movies, you can often see brave Frenchmen who joined the partisans all over the country to fight the Germans. In reality, 0.5% of the country's population was actively opposing the invaders. Moreover, according to even the Western expert in this matter, Robert Paxton, most of these actions ended in failure. In his opinion, as well as in the opinion of many scientists, even the complete absence of French resistance would not have affected the outcome of World War II in any way, even if this does not negate the fact of the heroism of its participants. The partisans of Belarus, Ukraine, and the RSFSR played a much greater role, and, if we talk about Europe, it was the Yugoslavs who organized the Akanalia there, which is only worth the Uzhit and Bihać republics, founded by partisans right on the territories conquered by the Germans. Moreover, the republics were quite large, and there were 41 and 42 years in the yard, the times of the peak of the German army's power. In general, we strongly advise everyone to familiarize themselves with the participation in the Second World War, not only of major powers, but also of smaller European countries, because it was very hot there, even in terms of statistics and numbers. Well, we'll probably leave it at that.